Mr. Speaker.
I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to start my contribution just speaking briefly about the process issues that we're going through, and just to record that I do think it is unsatisfactory that we come to the House tonight having not had a committee of the whole House stage on this bill. I actually support this piece of legislation, and I'll explain my support for it in a moment, but I do think this was an issue that was foreseeable. It was raised with me a couple of months ago. I undertook to talk to various stakeholders on the issue in my own inner city electorate, and I do think there was the opportunity to have a better process than the one we're having now, because no matter what the good intent either of Mr. Seymour or of the members of the Justice and Electoral Committee, I fear that there will be unforeseen circumstances. Unforeseen things will arise as a result of this that we haven't had enough time to work through. There's even some confusion among members about exactly what provisions have stayed in the bill and what provisions haven't. So I regret the fact that we're doing it this way. I would rather that we were treating this matter with a little bit more caution and with a little bit more of the normal process that we have. And I just want to put on record that I think the government dropped the ball, and that will be one of very few rugby metaphors that I'll use in the speech, but there may be one or two others. But I do think that the government has dropped the ball in terms of not getting onto this issue earlier. I also think that while Mr. Seymour has taken the initiative on the bill, the government was at one point going to take it up itself, and again I think it probably would have been better had they done that. That isn't what happened, and we stand here tonight having to debate this bill in the form that we are. Mr. Speaker, in the Wellington area, a number of special licences had already been granted to establishments to screen games for the Rugby World Cup. And the process that those establishments went through was a thorough one. They spoke with the District Licensing Authority, the police were involved, and they were granted special licences with a series of conditions. That process should be the process that we're able to follow for events like the Rugby World Cup. However, around the country, inconsistent approaches were abounding. The idea of ridiculous conditions being put on the licences became, it seemed, a tactic to be used in certain authorities by certain people who had a concern about the licence. And so we got the stories of people needing to run fancy dress parties or quiz nights or have MCs and all sorts of things like that. The inconsistency of that process concerns me, and I think it would be far better if this legislation was actually about special licences rather than a blanket exemption. For me, that is what I thought I was doing as a member of this Parliament when we passed the last Sale of Liquor Act changes, that a special event like the Rugby World Cup would generate a situation where a special licence would be provided. It has become clear for many people in this process, either deliberately in terms of trying to make it more difficult to get special licences, or simply because this is how they interpreted it, that the special event is the thing that happens in the licensed premise, not the thing that is on the screen on the television. And for me as a member of this Parliament, I always felt we were passing legislation where an event like the Rugby World Cup on the screen would be the special event. And if had that interpretation been consistently taken around New Zealand, then we would have had applications for special licences on the basis of the event, the Rugby World Cup. So I want to put on record, Mr. Speaker, that my preference would have been to be able to use the special licence process on the understanding that the special event was the event, the Rugby World Cup. And we will have to revisit this, because we can't keep doing this every time a major event in the world comes up. And I would much rather we were in that situation. But Mr. Speaker, my reason for supporting this bill relates to the fact that the Rugby World Cup is a special event. Obviously, I am a huge rugby fan. I appreciate that not everybody else is. But I think we can all understand that the Rugby World Cup will be an event quite different from any other that we see. That people want to come together for these events. This is about a sense of community. It isn't about a sense of wanting to get onto long, drawn-out drinking benders. The few people who might think that that's what they want to do are going to find they're not going to be able to. They're going to find that actually both the police and the licence holders are not going to let them do that. They know there will be huge scrutiny on them as part of this bill, and it simply will not occur. What this will be about is people coming together for what are iconic moments in their history, and that won't necessarily just be confined to New Zealanders. The passion with which people from other nationalities will follow their teams will match New Zealanders, and we will see, when Samoa play, when South Africa play, we will see huge turnouts of people wanting to be part of that. Mr. Speaker, I believe there is more danger of people leaving pubs in a caffeine and bacon-induced haze than there is in an alcoholic haze out of these events, because that's what will happen. And we do need to be practical and real about this. People will mostly be there having breakfast, because that's the timing of the games where they would be wanting to be out, and that's what I know in my own heart is what will happen. That is not to diminish the concerns that have been raised tonight about our drinking culture and about the laws that govern the way in which alcohol is used and sold in New Zealand. I think Chris Bishop did a disservice to this bill by standing up in this house and trying to diminish binge drinking in New Zealand and its impact. It is a real thing. Standing in this house and saying it's a myth and it doesn't exist actually is a silly, no, it is what he said, Mr. Naylor. I listened to Chris Bishop's speech, and you could see the old tobacco lobbyist coming out, taking the statistics, twisting them around for his argument. And I think that was a silly set of arguments for Chris Bishop to make. And I want to put on the record again, Mr. Speaker, we do need to look at the drinking culture that we have in New Zealand. We need to look at things like hours of sale, cost of alcohol, the abuse of alcohol, education. This bill's not going to sort that out, Mr. Speaker, and opposing this bill isn't going to sort that out. And so I continue to support the bill, but I don't appreciate those arguments. I don't think they're helpful, and I think Mr. Bishop needs to look again and spend a little bit of time, perhaps with an A&E staff member on a Saturday night before he does that. I also want to acknowledge the concerns that have been raised about the linkage between alcohol and domestic violence. They are serious issues that New Zealand needs to get its head around. Again, though, I don't believe that opposing this legislation is the way in which we will address those particular issues, Mr. Speaker. I do think it's important to relate the matter around the conditions of licences. The licences that were granted in a place like Wellington take into account the concerns of those who live in the inner city, and I want to acknowledge the Wellington Inner City Association, who have put a very good submission in on this bill about their concerns. They are the people who wake up in the morning when those bottles crash down when they're being thrown out. They are the people who will be concerned about the courtyard noise, and so I appreciate the work that the Justice and Electoral Committee did in knocking out some of those things. But I have to acknowledge that the Wellington Inner City Association would rather it went further, would rather that there was more restrictions around that. And we do have to appreciate the mixed use of inner city environments. Having said that, all of the conditions that apply to licences other than ours will continue to apply. And I am quite sure that the police will keep a very close eye on that in the Wellington Central area, as they always do. I'm very pleased to see the provision around people whose licences have been suspended not being able to use the provisions of this bill. We should not reward bad behaviour. We should make sure that those pubs understand that they are not able to be part of the special occasion because of what they have done. I also want to note, Mr. Speaker, the provisions that basically say that the only way that noise restrictions that will apply that aren't in this bill are ones where they are more restrictive than what is in this bill, and I think it's very important that we maintain the faith that we are putting in people behaving responsibly. So, Mr. Speaker, I will be supporting this legislation. I don't think this is the best way that this House could have gone about this. I do think that we need to sort out the provisions around special licences and special events. I do think there could have been some more conditions imposed, particularly around the question of being closer to schools and other things like that. But on balance, Mr. Speaker, this is a special event as I envisaged a special event when the Sale of Liquor Act changes went through. I think we need to work together as a community to reduce and eliminate harm from alcohol. We must continue to do that regardless of what we're doing here today. But this piece of legislation, on balance, is one that I can support.